Good afternoon. It's almost evening now. I'm sorry about the delay. Standard IT issues with compatibility of NHS software with etc. etc. Anyway, welcome to Grand Rounds. My name's Tom Fowden and I'm the chair and organiser of Grand Rounds. February is LGBT month, and every year at Grand Rounds we hand over the reins for one of the talks to the university LGBT group. To have an LGBT-themed presentation. We've had a number of very interesting presentations over the years on a number of wide-ranging issues, which are of interest to all of us as clinicians and healthcare professionals. And this year, I'm very pleased to welcome Michael Ung, who's one of our local plastic surgeons. He's given the title of A Trans Journey Through Space and Time. And he promises that there aren't any gory pictures, but as I suggested, I suspect his threshold for gory is somewhat different from my threshold, so gird your loins just in case. And he's going to talk about the history of trans surgery, about gender affirmment surgery, about the services that are provided here in Scotland and locally, and how we might adjust those services going forwards. So you're very welcome, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing your talk.
Thanks, Tom, and thanks, everyone. My name's Michael Ung, and I've got a special interest in gender affirmation surgery. My training in gender affirmation surgery was made possible by very generous grants from the Winston Churchill Memorial Trust and the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons, Glasgow. So, I'm hoping this works. So this is a bit of audience participation, as you can tell by the slide. So if you close your eyes and you can imagine yourself lying on that hammock which you made with your own hands underneath the shade of the trees on a deserted island, and you're lying absolutely naked. And you picture yourself from top to toe. You're tanned. You're effortlessly lean because of this new lifestyle that you've got outdoors. You've got a wee smile on your face because you're just like, yeah, this is pretty good. I like what I'm seeing. Right. And you imagine yourself from top to toe. And then suddenly, splat, you wake up, there's this seagull from Dundee that's just splattered something very disgusting all over you. You wake up and you look at yourself. And you look at your chest and your genitals. And this bears not much resemblance to what you had in mind just a moment ago. Now, this doesn't even come close to trying to explain what it feels like to have gender dysphoria, where your perception of your gender identity, your gender, is completely incongruent with your biological sexual characteristics. Now, I promise from here on it's all about dry medical terminology and statistics. We'll also look at trans history chronologically, looking at it geographically and from a legal standpoint in terms of where trans activism started and how it's led to civil rights, equality, and fighting for the rights for access to healthcare for trans patients. We'll also have a discussion about why medical and surgical treatment is essential for the care of trans patients, what the current delivery service is like in Scotland, followed by potential future work in Tayside. So, what is gender and what is sex? The two very distinct ideas. Gender is a social construct. It is what society and the culture around you think is your role within that society, traditionally as male or female. So it's about how you look, how you carry yourself, how you talk, the work you do, for example. You're starting to get the idea. Sex is about your biological, secondary, and primary sexual characteristics. When a baby is born, the team delivering the baby looks at the genitalia, which is your primary sexual characteristics, and go, this is male or female. Now, our work with disorders of sexual development, we understand that genitalia are not two mutually exclusive concepts sorry, can't find the word for it. But it's not mutually exclusive the way it's expressed. It's actually a spectrum. So keep that in mind when we're talking about gender as well. It's not quite the two distinct, mutually exclusive gender identities that we're talking about. It's actually a spectrum. Now, as the baby grows into a child, it has no sense of itself in terms of its gender. A lot of this is input from family, friends, society, and that influences the way a person thinks about what their gender role is themselves and in society. So this is what's termed as your assigned gender. It's based on your biological sex. You identify as male or female, and within the trans community, there's a term called cisgender, and it's a play on the term of trans and cis in, for example, organic chemistry. And if you're cisgender, it suggests that your gender identity is congruent with your biological sexual characteristics. So you feel female, your body looks female, and vice versa, you feel male, your body looks male. Everyone's happy so far. Now, your preferred gender or your gender identity is what's on the inside, is how you see yourself. Now, that could be male, that could be female, it could be transgender, and then you've got your gender non-conforming identities, which are, that's not all of it, there's more to it, but I've just given a selection there. Some of you may or may not have come across the terms AMAB and AFAB, and that's assigned male at birth and assigned female at birth. And this is a stock image of a word cloud from around about 2017. And these are terms that are relatively commonly used to describe gender identity. And I can assure you that if you were to do a word cloud of 2018, 2019, that word cloud image would look quite different from this one. And what this goes to show is that there is an evolution of how people are starting to describe themselves as they feel much more confident in trying to express what their gender identity is. Now, some of you may think, well, this is political correctness gone mad, because we as humans like to box things into neat little categories, and this is just an explosion of words, and everyone tries to define themselves in their own way as best they can, and it's constantly changing. But my argument is this: who are we to say this is how you should describe yourself? This is about the individual and their right to determine who they are, just like every one of us has that right to express ourselves. And it's about that basic rights and respect you give your fellow human being, and that's the way I see it. Sexual orientation is a completely different thing altogether. We're used to the idea of heterosexual, homosexual, bisexual, but once again, like gender identities, there's now been an acceptance that there is more than just the three available flavours. Gender dysphoria has been defined in DSM-4 as the distress that comes as a result of the incongruence between someone's preferred gender and their biological sexual characteristics. Now, gender dysphoria has traditionally been seen as a mental illness, and the associated stigma with it you can just imagine. There's been moves now to try and move this towards sexual health, and we'll just touch upon that later on. Gender affirmation surgery, that's the newer term that's being used nowadays. You may have heard before the terms sex reassignment surgery, gender reassignment surgery, the list goes on. Whoop. Not time to read my emails. So, once again, this boils down to the same concept that terminology is evolving. Dead name. Has anyone heard of dead name? Yeah. Susie has. The term dead name roughly translates to this. It is the name you were given at birth, and you no longer use that name. So, by using someone's dead name will bring up a lot of distress, a lot of embarrassment, especially if it's shouted out in the public. For example, calling your patient's dead name in the middle of your clinic to ask them to come through, and you say, Danielle, for example, and then big beard, walking down like that. How would that feel for the patient? Sorry, we'll get this working. Or not. So, using someone's dead name really just signifies a lack of understanding of where they come from. So why do we want to understand the journey of a trans person as an individual and as a community? What's the point of this whole talk? Because if you look at it, there are a few faces that are familiar there on the screen. You've got Nadia from Big Brother, for those of us old enough to remember that. There's Caitlyn Jenner from the Kardashians. There's Chaz Bono, who's Cher's son. And the last person down there, hands up anyone who actually recognises that face. Queen Mother's orthopaedic surgeon, or was involved in the orthopaedic care. So you think, well, trans people are out there, they're recognised, they have, well, you'd think equal rights. There's hardly any discrimination, they're very accepted in the public sphere. You know, it's really countries like Malaysia, where I grew up in, where, you know, it's quite oppressive, they're not recognised, so they live in the margins of society. But is that a right reflection of what's happening even in Britain nowadays? Because I challenge you to think about this yourself. If you've ever come across a trans person in your clinic, or heard of someone saying, oh, they met a trans person in their clinic, and then you go, difficult interaction coming up now. Because the clinician is expecting hostility and anger coming from the patient. And why do we have that perception? And why does the patient have that element of anger and hostility in the background? And it's until we understand their journey that we realise the amount of discrimination, harassment, and inequality that they face throughout their journey. And you see the end product in front of you. Still not happening.
I think it might be running underneath.
Does it? Oh, yes, you are correct. Right. So if we go back in time, before Judaism, Christianity, and Islam were predominant religions in the world, and you look at traditional societies, in the two continents of the Americas, there were the concept of the two-spirited people, and they hold quite a revered status in their society. Religious leaders, people you go to for advice. In the African continent, there's documentation of several spiritual beliefs around the continent where the deities are represented as intersex or gender fluidity. The Hijra in India are a small community who are now recognized as a third gender in India, who essentially bless ceremonies, and equally they can curse you if you cross them. In China, back in the old days when spiritual beliefs were allowed, there is a deity called Guan Yin, or the goddess of mercy. And they were originally male, but asked to be reincarnated as female. And incidentally, they've got a pet rabbit on the moon. And anyone heard of China sending the rover to the dark side of the moon recently? Named after the pet rabbit. The Mudang in the Korean peninsula are shamans who are a little bit more gender fluid. And in Albania, if you state that you are a virgin and you prove it, as in a female virgin, then you are afforded the rights, responsibilities, and privileges of male in their society. So there was quite a lot of gender fluidity back in the old days, we think. James Barry died in 1965, army surgeon originally from Ireland. Upon his death, was found to be female. He was the one that pioneered a safer cesarean section. And a lot of the arguments then, and now still, is, well, you couldn't have had that career if he was a woman. And so he dressed up as a man and got a career as a man, and that's why. But then, how would you explain the reverse, where men presented themselves as female in society, because that affords absolutely no privileges at all back in the Victorian times. And there was, in 1880, there was a document about how there was a drag ball in Manchester and there's a police raid on it, and this was well before RuPaul's Drag Race. 1950s in America, Christine Jorgensen was the first person to be widely known to have gender affirmation surgery. Then in the UK the next year, this was the first documentation of the birth certificate being changed from male to female after gender affirmation surgery. Now I'm going to add a little bit of the sort of gay and lesbian history in here as well, to just sort of put things into a bit more context. And in England and Wales in 1967, there was a partial decriminalisation of homosexuality. And that is one of the many iconic photographs of the Stonewall Rebellion in 1969 in New York. Now, this kick-started the global movement to fight for gay, lesbian, transgender rights. And what was happening back then was that the community would gather in the Stonewall Inn in New York just to have a place where they could be themselves, but they were constantly facing harassment from the police and the public. And one night, one police raid too far, they decided enough is enough, and the community rioted and had demonstrations for 3 days and 3 nights. Corbett versus Corbett, 1971 in England, set the precedent that a person's sex cannot legally be changed. This was because of April Ashley, who married a lord. And the lord, I can't remember his name for the life of me, knew that April Ashley was male prior to the gender affirmation surgery. So they got married and they got divorced. Now, during the divorce proceedings, the argument was that a person's sex cannot legally be changed, and therefore April Ashley was never a woman, and therefore the marriage was never legal, and therefore there shouldn't be a divorce, because it never happened. And so April Ashley got nothing. 1979, the Harry Benjamin International Gender Dysphoria Association was created. This set out the standards of care for transgender people, and it's adopted internationally. And these are the standards that we use in Britain and in Scotland. The association has now changed its name to the World Professional Association for Transgender Health. Scotland finally caught up in 1980 and partially decriminalised homosexuality. And then in 1988, Scotland, England and Wales separately had their own legislation which essentially says that homosexuality cannot be promoted in schools. The next year, Caroline Cossey in the UK was recognised. Said that she was recognised as female, and this was ruling by the European Court of Human Rights. And then the next year, it was reversed on appeal. So there's a lot of going forwards and backwards in this history. Then in 1996, there was an employment tribunal because an employee of Cornwall County Council went up to the employers and said, I'm trans, I'm going to transition to become female. And this was just alerting the employers that this is what's happening. And what did the employers do? They fired her. An employment tribunal found that there was no grounds for discrimination. And the reason for that is they would have done the same for a trans man. What twisted logic is that? Anyway, eventually, the European Court of Justice ruled that yes, there was discrimination. And from there were better rights for employment of trans people. And in the 1990s and 2000s, Professor Stephen Whittle, who's a professor of law in the Manchester Metropolitan University, started the Press for Change organisation that fought really hard for civil rights issues pertaining to trans people, specifically around marriage, birth certificates, right to privacy, NHS treatment, and other equality laws. And in the year 2000, the Scottish Parliament repealed Section 2A about promoting homosexuality as one of its first legislations in the new Scottish Parliament. Now, this was in the background of a massive bus company based in Scotland, which I will not name, who contributed £1 million to the campaign to keep Section 2A in order not to promote homosexuality in schools. Safe to say, I've not ridden that bus for 20 years. Gender Recognition Act came in 2004. This was a process where trans people would put in a lot of their documents, letters of reference from the gender identity clinics, their doctors, and essentially apply to have them legally recognised in the gender that they prefer to be. What did this mean? If you were married, your marriage had to be dissolved in the first place. Then your spouse had to grant you your legal gender recognition. Then you enter into civil partnership, which at that time did not afford all the privileges a marriage provided. I'll not go into the legalities of all of it. The Equality Act in 2010 was fantastic. Transgender was recognised as a protected characteristic. What they did not quite figure out was how much problems that's going to cause bureaucratically for a transgender person. Try calling HMRC to ask about your tax code and you've got a protected characteristic. 6 phone calls, between 20-30 minutes of hanging on the phone, waiting for someone to find someone with a higher authority in order to unlock your file and speak to you. Horrendous. And then Scotland produced the Gender Reassignment Protocol, which you'll have a look at in 2012. Brighton had the first trans pride in the UK in 2013. And then Scotland passed the Marriage and Civil Partnership Act in 2014, in which the partner cannot veto the Gender Recognition Act, and there's no requirement to dissolve a marriage or civil partnership. And all this is in efforts to try and streamline the process for someone trying to transition and be legally recognised as the gender that they prefer. And in Edinburgh in 2018, we had the first Scottish Trans Pride. And that's me celebrating my child's second birthday by marching through the frozen streets of Edinburgh. WHO in 2018 has published the ICD-11, which has gender incongruence in sexual health now results. And Scotland announced that as the first country in the world to have an LGBTI inclusive curriculum in its education. And we plug for Dundee, second Scottish Pride, next month. And Nicola Sturgeon just gave a speech in the UN, I think probably a few days ago, which essentially states how there are moves now to try and allow self-determination when you apply for your gender recognition certificate. And that's really to once again try and streamline that process and reduce the discrimination and perceived barriers to being able to express your gender the way you want it to be. So, on to the next topic quickly. What is it like being trans in the world today? We don't have statistics for which countries recognise gender identity incongruence or the third gender. UNHCR in 2017 ruled that surgical sterilisation is not a prerequisite for gender recognition. However, 22 European countries haven't changed their legislation yet, so they still require their population to have surgical sterilisation, which technically isn't quite necessary. Britain doesn't require surgical sterilisation. There have been more than 270 reported murders of gender-diverse persons worldwide in 2017. And if you look at HIV rates worldwide in adult women of childbearing age, WHO states the prevalence is around about 19%. You're 49 times more likely to have HIV than the average population if you're a trans woman. You might think, well, that's because, maybe developing country doesn't recognise them being transgender. Their appearance does not match their official documentation and therefore difficult to find work. You need to feed yourself. What do? Resort to the world's oldest profession, prostitution. But if you look at America, where being transgender is recognised, there are services available for trans people. A trans woman, within the trans population, a trans woman has got an incidence of 27.7% of HIV. And this is because about a quarter to half of them are engaged in risky sexual behaviour, not using protection, multiple sexual partners, involved in the sex trade, out of necessity rather than choice. And this is because of the prevailing discrimination that still exists in society. So what has it been like being trans in progressive Britain nowadays? This is the biggest study done on in the trans population in the UK, published in 2012. 92% of respondents have been told at some point in their lifetime that being trans is not normal. 73% have been called names right in front of their faces. 38% have experienced physical intimidation, threats, sexual harassment, and the list goes on. Now, when I was writing an article about gender affirmation surgery, I'd mentioned that there was a 6% of rape within the population. And the question to me by the editor was, well, isn't that about the same for the general population? There are no direct comparisons, but I managed to dredge up some statistics from the Office of National Statistics for England and Wales in 2016. And this is specifically looking at people who have experienced rape or sexual serious assaults. And it is relatively similar to the definition for the Trans Mental Health Study in 2012. A trans person within their lifetime has experienced sexual assault in 14% of the population and 6% have experienced rape. Compare that to the population of England and Wales, which is 2.7%. And if you think that's over a lifetime, what about within the last year? 0.3% in the last year in the population, whereas within the trans population, it's 4% for sexual assault and 2% for rape. 25% have moved away from their social network because of problems with their family, their friends. And this social isolation that they face is one of the biggest things that I'll argue about for trying to bring services for trans people closer to home for them rather than to send them far away for it. Because this is exactly when they need their social network around them rather than send them off. 19% have faced homelessness. Unemployment rates of the same year. General population, Office of National Statistics again, 8.3% unemployment. Trans population, 35%. Reasons why, some of them, I've put it up there for you to see. 63% of the trans population, before they transitioned to their preferred gender, have experienced suicidal ideation or attempts. They've got a higher rate of depression and anxiety than the average population pre-transition. So what happens when you help them align their preferred gender and their biological sex? So trans mental health study, long-term cohort studies from Sweden and Belgium, all of them have shown there's a reduction in dysphoria, they improve their quality of life, their mental well-being goes back to the level of the general population, although any pre-existing psychological comorbidity still remains. You can't change that. You reduce suicidal ideation and attempts, but all of this can be achieved for as long as there is good support network. Now, when a person walks into the room, we all make micro-judgments and snap judgments, whether that person is male or female. We don't consciously think about it. Now, we have our personal views of what male and female actually constitutes. This is informed by your cultural background and the society that you live in, and you project that image, like me standing here in a suit and shirt, projecting a male image of someone who's kind of in a formal environment. And that's what you perceive. Now, when an individual walks into a room, it is their face, the way they dress, the way they talk, the pitch of their voice. You might see some secondary sexual characteristics that inform you male or female. And you won't necessarily see their genitals unless it's an intimate moment or you're changing. So what we can change without medicine or surgery are things like makeup for the face, the way you dress, wigs, alteration of your speech, for example, with speech and language therapy. Hormones help feminize or masculinize a person to a certain degree and develop some of the secondary sexual characteristics. And surgery just takes things further and provides a permanent change, normally of the face, the chest, and the genitals. This is the gender reassignment protocol in a nutshell. I'll break it down in more easily. You live 12 months in your preferred gender whilst you're being assessed by the gender identity specialist. You may start on some hormone treatment or some treatment that is reversible round about this time to help you transition if need be. This is about the same time that you start getting your documents in to reflect your change in gender to your preferred gender. Then you need a second assessment formally for hormones and surgery. And if that is all fine, then you proceed with your treatment. So it's a long process. Still part of the protocol. These are surgeries exclusive to trans people. I'll let you have a read because it's a big long list. I'm not going to read it all out. But you can see it's generally genital masculinization or feminization and chest masculinization. Surgeries that are not exclusive to trans people were previously being lumped under the exceptional referral protocol. Now, this has now been removed because it's recognised that the reasons why a cisgendered person would be declined breast augmentation due to their severe psychological distress about their breasts is exactly the reason why you would actually carry out chest feminization on a trans person. So what are the current services in Scotland like? It's a managed clinical network from the medical point of view with 4 gender identity clinics. Map of Scotland, and this is where it gets fun. Right, Glasgow. It's based in Sandyford. They receive referrals either from the patients themselves or professionals from the whole of Scotland, and they carry out the first and second assessments for hormones and surgery. Edinburgh, based in Chalmers. They take only professional referrals from Lothian, Fife and the Borders. A practice nurse or a psychologist carries out the first assessment, and an MDT carries out the second assessment for hormones, but if they want surgery, they get referred to Glasgow for that second assessment. Inverness, they take referrals from the patients or from professionals. They cover NHS Highland, Western Isles and Shetland. They are first assessed by a physician, and the second assessment for hormones and surgeries, the patients go to Glasgow. See a pattern here. Aberdeen covers NHS Grampian, Orkney and Shetland. Still under development. It's a long story, I'll not go into it. The aim is to provide first and second opinions for hormones. And for surgery, guess what? Oh, wrong arrow. It's supposed to point to Glasgow. Unless Glasgow's just suddenly moved up north to Iceland. In Tayside, we currently have a hub and spokes model where the community mental health team, led by a psychologist, and we've got adjunctive treatments from our speech and language therapy team and also the laser team, who will help optimize the management of the patient as much as they can before they go down to Glasgow for the first and second opinions. Kind of clear? Yeah. Surgical treatment, we'll whiz through this. Currently, surgical treatment for chest masculinization is going to Manchester, London for phalloplasty, Brighton for your vaginoplasty, and these 3 are currently contracted under national services. So national services take money off every single health board, puts it in a pot, sends the patients down south for these surgeries. In Dundee, we offer surgical voice feminization, and other individual units provide chest and facial feminizing, and this is paid for by each individual health board. And these are Glasgow, Edinburgh, Dundee and Aberdeen. Surprisingly, these are centres which have got a plastics unit and a maxillofacial unit as well. We're nearly there. Right. Tayside. Tayside, as you know, geographically, almost in the middle of Scotland. We currently have all the necessary specialties to have a fantastic surgical centre that will provide all the surgeries from top to bottom under one roof, where you can imagine a patient who's been sent all over the country for their surgeries. You can actually sit down, see someone and go, right, you want facial feminizing, you want breast feminizing, and you want genital feminizing. Right, How about this? First stage, we do your face and breast. Give it a few months, let you recover. We'll do your genitals after that. 2 hospital admissions instead of 3. The same goes for the masculinizing side of things. And the idea is that we bring the services close to the patients and we offer them something that's much more joined up. And one of the missing links is a gender identity clinic based in Tayside. And there's currently talks happening right now to discuss how can we deliver a safe gender identity clinic model in Tayside. Does it make sense to have a centralised surgical centre in Scotland? And will it work? Well, I hope the first bit that I said earlier kind of made an argument that, yes, it could be done, but logistically, can it truly be done? I spent 3 months in Finland, who have got a similar population size as Scotland, a similar geographical distribution of their population as Scotland, and a similar health service as Scotland. And they've got a centre that's been running for 10 years, and they're starting to get referrals from Estonia, Sweden. The referrals are coming in from other countries. So you can imagine that this service, if started in Tayside, could potentially start attracting a worldwide reputation. Is there political will for this, and is there evidence for this? The short answer to that is yes. In 2017, the Scottish Public Health Network published a healthcare needs assessment report, and essentially says what I said earlier, which is that there are no surgical services for gender reassignment in Scotland, and we need to reduce the travel and financial burden and social burden to a certain extent of Scottish trans persons undergoing surgery. And their recommendations were that 1, we consider establishing an additional gender identity clinics, and one of them ideally would be Tayside. That's the bit that I've added. And we should explore the development of gender reassignment surgical provision in Scotland. And finally, a wee plug again, the Trans Pride Scotland's going to be in Dundee. And they're looking for volunteers, or even just someone standing by the sides going, hey, just to let them know that they've got people on their side and that there are people helping them. A friendly face, one that hopefully after this talk understands them just a wee bit better. Thank you.
Zero gory pictures, by anyone's definition. Oh, there you go. Sorry, I'm off. You can wait. Okay, so has anyone got any questions? Last time, I apologise for the IT woes, but such is the nature of NHS IT. Any questions? No. Is what you've talked about in terms of the service just adults, or are you encompassing adolescents, children as well?
Currently it's adults. Because with surgical services, you're not allowed to, according to the protocol, you can't operate on anyone under 18. So we're focusing on adults first of all.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, Susie.
Thanks. I'm just wondering, is there stability in the numbers, or is there an increase if we, did develop this service in Tayside? I absolutely agree, as you know from my own experience with my husband, the travel aspect coming up after that surgery from Brighton is absolutely horrific. But I'm just wondering what the numbers are like and what the future we think the numbers might be.
Yeah. The numbers fluctuate. Looking at the numbers and speaking to the Scottish Transgender Alliance, who are very heavily involved in planning for all of this, is that in the last few years there's been an exponential increase in referrals for surgery. However, there's been signs of perhaps a plateau that we're reaching right now. We don't foresee the numbers going down drastically to what they were previously in like 2012 or something like that, but certainly we're looking at approximately 80 to 100 chest masculinizations a year, probably about 40, 50 genital feminizing a year, and probably 10 to 20 phalloplasties a year.
Okay, so if there's no more questions or comments, then I'd just like to thank Michael for an excellent talk. I thank you for coming. It's always a pleasure to have to host the LGBT focused talk, and I'm sure we'll do it again next year. It's nice to see some previous speakers in the audience. Next week is diabetes. It's a sugar diabetes, Chris. You should come along to that, learn a thing or two about the sugar diabetes. Scott Cunningham's going to speak about diabetes and the advances in technology that are available to patients and to healthcare professionals. So, big round of applause again for Michael, and I'll see you again next week. Thanks very much. Good stuff.